are recording. All right, so welcome to Esther. We're going to go through it kind of in chunks. I hope a few of you got to do the reading to kind of see what's going on in all the detail. There's so many good little bits. I don't want you to miss any of it, but let's, can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so we're going to look at the book of Esther, and let's start with just a little bit of background because we were kind of talking beforehand. It is unusual. There's not a lot of books of the Bible that take place in parts that we don't normally call the Holy Land, but this one is set in Susa, which would be in present-day Iran, which adds a whole another layer to the story. But let's look at a little bit what's going on here. So first, if you review your ancient Israelite history, you remember in 931, the nation splits from Israel to Israel and Judah, Judah being the southern kingdom. And as those two kingdoms move through their histories, they both get overrun by foreign powers, by Mesopotamian powers. So in 722, the northern kingdom, Israel, falls to the Assyrians. And then in 587 into 586, Judah falls to Nebuchadnezzar II. The Babylonians ransack Jerusalem. They tear down the walls. They destroy the temple brick by brick. And then they take the intelligentsia, the wealthy, the royal class, the priestly class, and they schlep them all off to Babylon. All right, so this is typical Babylonian and Assyrian statecraft. This is how they control territories they take over. They take the people who they think could cause trouble, and they take them out of their element. So these folks go to Babylon. Then, in 539, along come the Medes and the Persians through a pass in the Zagros Mountains, which is what today still is the boundary between Iraq and Iran. But the Persians come from what would be northern Iran. They come south. They come into Babylon and they overthrow the Babylonian Empire. And Cyrus does this, really takes over Babylon without firing a shot, as they say, because the Babylonians were so frustrated with their own king, who was not paying the right kind of homage, respect to the gods of Babylon, that Cyrus came in, and the first thing he did is he went up to the temple and honored Marduk, which made him a hero. And so the people willingly gave themselves over to Persian rule. So this is in 539. And in 538 is the Edict of Return. The Persian king signs an order that says all the peoples of Judah were allowed to return. And when they return them, they eventually give them money to establish and rebuild a temple as well. Because the Persians weren't just nice guys. They had a plan. They said we could hold an empire together better by allowing limited self-rule and stable vassal states all throughout the empire rather than trying to control everyone. So they allowed Judah to return. They allowed them to build a temple. They allowed them to have a priest and a governor. They just couldn't have a king because they wanted to hold everything from India to Egypt into Europe. And so they wanted Judah as a good kind of stable environment to be able to have campaigns into Africa. So the Jews could return. Now they do return, and in 520 to 516 is the process that we read about in the prophets of the rebuilding of the temple. And so that temple is finally finished. Then we hear about Ezra a little bit after, who goes back as the high priest. We hear about Nehemiah rebuilding the walls, but this is all going on in about that time. Now, the thing that's surprising to a lot of people when we think about the book of Esther is the book of Esther is happening about 485. during the rule of Xerxes. Okay, so Esther and her family are not there under duress, really. They had the option to go back. They decided this is where they wanted to be. And it's interesting because throughout the history of Judaism, the Jews who stayed in Mesopotamia, in Iraq and Iran, that was really the leading Jewish community in the world, even more so than the ones in Jerusalem. And the proof of this is that you have two different versions of the Talmud, the great, Jewish collection of holy writings and commentating on the Torah. And there is the Babylonian Talmud, and there is the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalemite or the Palestinian Talmud. And where those two documents disagree, where they conflict, the Babylonian Talmud is considered the authority. All right, so this is a very renowned community that stayed there all the way until 1948 in the forming of the State of Israel. Okay, so this is the backdrop of which this book starts. Now, as I told you last week, this is this story filled with all kinds of shocking details, which is why the holiday of Purim is the mix between Halloween and Mardi Gras for the Jewish people. And here are just a few of the reasons why. We touched on some of these last week. Question number one, right? Somebody's like, well, wait, all the good guys are supposed to go back to Jerusalem because that's God's city, the navel of the universe, right? Why is Esther and Mordecai still there? And then we have to ask, why are they named after foreign deities? That isn't what you would expect for a Bible hero, right? You wouldn't expect them being named after a god and goddess, the chief god and goddesses of Mesopotamia. When we actually realize that it doesn't quite fit our Sunday school version about how Esther wins the king over. I remember as a child hearing, that she won a beauty contest, which, thought, wow, Bob Barker was alive all the way back then. But that isn't what happens when we read carefully. She's part of the harem, and everybody gets there one night with the king, and she was so impressive, he said, I found my queen, which has all kinds of other issues. The movie, has anyone seen the movie called One Night with the King, which is one of these modern, retelling of a Bible story? It avoids this kind of icky aspect of the book because, it's meant for family viewing. So it kind of conflates two parts of the story. Where, remember in the story where, the king has trouble sleeping, so he has people come in and read to him? Well, they kind of turn that into Esther's role. And so her night where she goes to see the king, he's like, I can't sleep, so can you read a little? And it was like, oh, you are such a good reader. How can I live without this woman? And so, that was her one night with the king, as she was like his proto book on tape. But anyway, you can put that on the flannel graph in Sunday school more than what actually happened. So again, that's another one of those parts where like, wait, what just happened? And then we get to the end of the book, this double massacre, which we'll talk about because there were some horrifying modern connections to that. And then the one that you've probably heard this before, but of all the books in the Bible, the name of God, Yahweh, no divine reference in the entire book. Which also makes some people go, just wait, it's in the Bible, but there's no mention of God ever. So we can talk a little bit about that too. So any questions about any of this background stuff? All right, let's look at the text then. I think that's, oh, one second. All right, can you see the text?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's just start with the beginning. Let me read a little bit. So again, King Ahasuerus in Hebrew, most people think is a Hebrew attempt to pronounce Xerxes. or Xerxes as it would be in Persian. So you don't have letters to make that sound. So most people think Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus in English is Xerxes, rather than there's also another king called Artaxerxes, but most scholars think this is Xerxes. So this happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the same Ahasuerus who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. And let me just make one comment. There is an aspect of the book of Esther which is about everything's grandiose. So if you look at Persian history and politics, Persia has something like 27 to 29 provinces, I think is the exact number. But in the book of Esther, it describes it as 127. All right. It is from North Africa to India, but people argue whether this is part of the exaggeration of the story or whether there was another way they counted regions that we don't know about today. But anyway, so that's a big number, more than most scholars would say makes sense. But that's going to fit some of the things we're about to see. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, in the 3rd year of the reign, he gave a banquet for all his officials and ministers. The army of Persia, Media, and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were present, while he displayed the great wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and pomp of his majesty for many days, 180 days in all. Okay, now again, sometimes we read the Bible and we just let things slide by us. And we don't think about what it's saying when it's just these little details. But realize, as it's portraying the Persians and King Ahasuerus, he had a 6-month party, okay? This is like the party king. He just has a 6-month banquet for everybody. And then look what happens. When these days were completed, the king gave all the people present in the citadel of Susa, both great and small, a banquet lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Like, you can't just wean off 6 months of party, right? Like, you need a 7-day after party. And then it goes on about the luxury, right? There were white cotton curtains, blue hangings tied with cords of linen, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read all this, but look at 7. All these drinks were served in golden goblets, goblets of different kinds, right? There's not one pattern. It's like all these different kind of golden goblets everybody's drinking out of. Royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. All right, they go on and on and on. At the same time, verse 9, furthermore, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the palace of King Ahasuerus. So you have the 6-month party, followed by the 7-day after party, then the queen's giving the women's party somewhere else. Okay? So this is like one long buzz for these people. And on the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, and here's all these, I was telling you, all these horrible Persian names, all these Persians, these 7 eunuchs who attended him, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing the royal crown in order to show the people and officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. And here we get, probably more than anywhere else in the Bible, that Vashti gets held up as the great, strong, feminist leader. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs. At this, the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him, right? She's like, I'm not going to your party to be shown off. I'm running my own party over here. So the king consults all his sages. Go down to verse 15. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and his officials, right? Here's the dilemma of the empire. Not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. All right, so it's like, this is not just an affront to the drunken party king. This is affront to all men everywhere that our wives aren't going to come when we tell them to. So what does the king do? We have to save the empire. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from the king. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians, the Medes, so that it may not be altered, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, vast as it is, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. All right, so like the story gets ickier as you go. So this advice pleased the king and the officials, and they did as they proposed. So they sent letters to all the provinces, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language, declaring that every man should be master in his own house. And right there, we have the dilemma that opens the story. Any questions about our raging picture of patriarchy and oppression? Okay, so I didn't mention this on the top of disturbing things, but what's the most disturbing for me is that now Mordecai is going to say to his relative, hey, why don't you want to be that guy's queen? But anyway, we won't worry about that today. So after this all happens and the anger of the king's abated, he remembered Vashti and what she'd done, his decree. And so he says, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint commissioners in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in the citadel of Susa under custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch who's in charge of the women. Let their cosmetic treatments be given them, and let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. All right, so this is the setup for our hero, Queen Esther. All right, now we shift for a second. Verse 5, we hear about Mordecai, son of Yair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with King Jeconiah of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. So it's showing his lineage. This is important. It's saying this isn't just some guy. Like, he is connected to people who were taken away from Jerusalem. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. See, Esther is her good Babylonian name. Hadassah is her Hebrew name. Hadassah is also the name of the big hospital in Jerusalem. That is Esther, his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. The girl was fair and beautiful. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And she pleased him, won his favor, and quickly provided her with cosmetic treatments and her portion of food and 7 chosen maids from the king's palace, and advanced her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or kindred, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. Every day, Mordecai would walk around in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. So right away, she gets a place of authority so that even as a woman preparing in the harem, she has her own maids to help get her ready. Now, this next section tells us about the preparation of these women. And before a woman could go in to be with the king, she had 12 months of beauty treatments before she could go in. All right, so there's 6 months, it says, of oil and myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And then, verse 13 and 14, when the girl went to the king, she was given whatever she asked for to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she went in, then in the morning she came back to the second harem in the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She did not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. All right, so this is the for a ancient despot like this, you had 2 harems. You had women who were preparing to go to the king, and then you had women who'd spent time with the king, and then they went into another category that the king had access to, but most of them just kind of stayed there and lived a life with the rest of the women. And then through this process, he was choosing his queen. So it tells us then when Esther's turn comes, it says that, she goes in, and if you look, it says verse 16, Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which again, she didn't even need her full 12-month treatment. He goes in the 10th month and says the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet, right? He's the banquet king, to all his officials and ministers. It was the Esther banquet. He also granted a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts with royal liberality. All right, so this sets up the main dilemma of the book. So, well, not even the dilemma. The dilemma was the king needs a queen. He gets a queen. But here's what's fascinating about the book of Esther. More so, the book of Esther is different than any other book in the Hebrew Bible because of the complexity of the plot. If you think of most biblical narratives, it pretty much has one straight narrative, plot line that we just follow through, right? And there's usually no more than two major characters interacting, sometimes a third. And we just kind of work our way, beginning, the rise to conflict, the resolution, and it's over. But the book of Esther has these subplots that are going on that lead to interesting conclusion to this story. All right, so right now, it seems like the whole story was about losing a queen and needing a queen. But then we get this little side story where King Mordecai, as we hear, he'd been kind of hanging around where the harem was kept. And when he's sitting at the king's gate, he hears a plan of some people who want to assassinate the king. He passes the knowledge on, and the king has these men executed, okay? But the king doesn't know that this Mordecai is any relation to Esther. But we just find out this detail is put in the annals of the king, okay? Now, new character, new plot problem. You have this man named Haman. He's a chief official, and we start to realize he's kind of the guy with the power trip. And when everyone's supposed to bow down, Mordecai, being a good Jew, he doesn't bow down because we don't bow down to anyone. So in verse 3, when he asks him, why do you disobey the king's command? You should be bowing down. When they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would avail, for he had told them that he was a Jew, right? So Jews had this caveat. People knew that they didn't bow down to other human beings. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance to him, he was infuriated. And this is where the next and the real thread of the book begins. But he thought it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom. All right? And then he goes in, he asks for permission to have this slaughter, and they end up deciding the day by casting a lot. All right, and that would decide what day would be the day to wipe out the Jews, okay? And when they would do that, the king would get rich because this money that would be captured would go to him, and it's all set by a lot. Now, it says the Persian word, they cast a pur, which means the lot. And the name of the holiday is Purim, meaning lots. So even interesting, you have a Jewish holiday named after the Persian word for lot, because they decided what day the massacre would be by the casting of lots. All right, so again, the king says, okay, deal's done. You can kill all these Jews on the 13th day of Adar. And so again, he writes up another edict that they put in every language that goes to every person. And look at verse 13 in this chapter. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces, giving orders to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Copy of the document was to be issued and decreed in every province by proclamation, calling on all the people to be ready for that day. Okay? So now we have a dilemma. Because as you recall, the king does not know that his bride, Esther, is a Jew. Mordecai said, don't tell anybody. So Mordecai finds out what happens. He mourns, tears up his clothes, mourning ritual. There's fasting and weeping in the city. Verse 4 of chapter 4, Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her the queen was distressed. She sends garments to Mordecai so that he could take off his sackcloth, but he wouldn't accept them. So he fills her in of what's about to happen. Okay? And they call a fast. Come down to verse 10 and 11 here. Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message to Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king, he tells her, you need to go talk to the king. This is why you have this, you've been put in this place. She says, everyone knows that if you go to the king without being summoned, there's one law, all alike are to be put to death. So even though, again, showing the way this king sees himself, even though she's the queen, she has no right to go in and talk for a plan to change this rule. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone, may that person live. I myself have not been called to come to the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king. Though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Now notice here, he has this sense of faith. Somehow, there will be deliverance for the Jews. But perhaps you will be the one to bring it. And that's maybe why you're in this position. Okay, any questions? So this sets up the dilemma. Even the queen can't just go see the king, but she knows she has to push the action here. She can't wait to be called. So what do? You throw a banquet because that's what this king likes. So on the third day, Esther put on her royal robe, stood in the inner court of the king's palace opposite the king's hall. The king was sitting in his royal throne inside the palace opposite the entrance. As soon as he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor and held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to half of my kingdom. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for the king. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther desires. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. While they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther said, "This is my petition and request. If I have won the king's favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and then I will do as the king has said." So it's like, she knows how the game's played, right? So she keeps throwing banquets where the request is to come to my next banquet for that request. This is right up the king's alley. So sure, this sounds great. But there's something happens in the meantime that elevates the conflict. Haman went out that day happy and in good spirits. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was infuriated with Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Then he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh, and Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the ministers of the king. And Haman added, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but myself come with the king to the banquet that she prepared. Tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this does me no good so long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the banquet in good spirits." This advice pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Now think about this. We're talking about us. This is good, more good Book of Esther overkill. This gallows will be about 75 feet in the air, right? So this is huge. Because everything is going well in my life, but as long as I see that Mordecai who won't bow to me, it's really not that good. Everything's tainted. All right? Now, notice this is where we see Esther. We're seeing her trickster nature as she keeps finding ways to set the trap. So here's the next side plot, which makes this conflict even better. So that night, the king can't sleep, before the banquet night. And he gave orders to bring the book of records, the annals that were read to the king, right? So nothing makes you fall asleep better than like reading the book of Chronicles. So it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh through the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and had conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai?" He realized, like, hey, did we do something for this guy? And then they realized nothing had been done. So the king said, "Who is in the court?" And they said, "Now Haman just entered the outer court in the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged." All right, so this is like perfect timing. This is like in the cartoons, right? Where everyone bumps into each other right at the right time. He's storming in because he wants to tell the king, "I hate this Mordecai guy, and I want you to kill him tomorrow." The king just so happened to have read to him the story of how Mordecai saved the king's life. So the king's servants told him, "Haman's there standing in the court." And the king says, "Let him come in." So Haman comes in, and the king said to him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" So Haman said to the king, "For the man who," right, he's thinking like he's asking for me now, so he's going to build this up. So Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king wishes to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, with a royal crown on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor.'" All right, so he just set this stage for this wonderful, glorious moment for me to be paraded around in the king's clothes on the king's horse and everyone cheering me. Then the king said to Haman, quickly, take the robes and the horse as you've said, and do so to the Jew Mordecai who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you've mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse and robed Mordecai and led him riding through the open square of the city, proclaiming. I can just see him like mumbling it under his breath. Thus shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. All right, so he hates this guy, and now he's just gotten the honor he wanted. So Haman is so mad, he could explode. When Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh, all his friends, everything that had happened to him, his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. Which is awesome. Like here we get this little foreshadowing, right? While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman off to the banquet that Esther had prepared. All right, the trap is fully set. So we go through the same rigmarole, right? What's your petition, Queen Esther? I'll give you up to half my kingdom. Esther answers. And notice, let me just back up. They go to this feast, and this is on the second day as they were drinking, right? They're really letting it roll here. Queen Esther answered, if I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me. That's my petition. And the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king. Then the king said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? Who has presumed to do this? Like, king's confused. Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went to the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Let me stop here for a second, because I'm always fascinated by this. He falls down upon her to beg for his life, but the king walks in, misunderstands, and sees it as this person was attacking his wife, therefore, all the more kill him. This is like a reuse, not a reuse, wrong word. This is the same trope with a slight variation that we get in the Joseph story. A foreigner, not in a royal palace, but in a palace of a wealthy lord, where the man is led to believe that Joseph had attacked his wife. But in that case, it was actually the woman trying to exploit Joseph, who then runs away and his garments are left. And it was used to say, look at what this person has, attacked me. Here the king comes in, he misinterprets, but sees it as the woman being attacked. As the words left his mouth, they covered Haman's face. They said, look, the very gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king was abated. All right. This is also a common trope in the Bible, particularly in Judges, where the enemies of God's people are killed with the weapons that they intended to use against them. Thinking like the Gideon story, where the men get confused and they stab each other with their own swords. Here we have Haman being killed with the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. but we still are going to have a problem. It seems like everything should be done, but it's not. The problem is when Esther says, hey, you have to take away the decree, the king says, I can't do that. Because verse 5, she said, if it please the king and have won his favor, if it seems right to the king and I have approval, let the order be written to be revoked. The letter is devised by Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote giving orders to destroy the Jew. But the problem is, the king cannot undo a decree. This is the, once it's spoken, it is. And he says, look, I've given Esther the house of Haman. I've hanged him in the gallows because he plotted to lay hands on the Jews. You may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king and seal it with the king's ring. So they can't revoke it, but you can make a new edict. And so look at the edict she makes. King's secretaries were summoned at the time in the 3rd month of 7th of Sivan. On the 23rd day, an edict was written. Again, it goes to all the places, blah, blah, blah. In it, it says, by these letters, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them with their children and women and to plunder their goods. So basically it said the new decree is those people can still attack you, but you have the right to defend yourself, gather and fight back. Okay, so verse 15, Mordecai gets put in the royal robes. Everyone's cheering for him. The Jews feel happy because we can fight back. So it's a festival and a time of celebration. On the one hand, it seems like, okay, so that should be the end of the story. But no, it's got to get a little bit weirder. So the day comes. We have to know what happens, right? So in the month of Adar, the day that this is going to all be carried out, the Jews gather in their cities and they lay hands on the people who are going to cause them ruin. Okay? No one could withstand them because the fear had come over them. And then in verse 4, it talks about Mordecai was powerful in the king's house. He has all this fame, right? Everything's like good for the Jews. And then look in verse 6. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 people and all the 10 sons of Haman. We get their names. But they didn't plunder anything. That very day, the number of those killed in the citadel in Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, in the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed 500 people and also the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's province? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted you. What further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. Notice what Esther says in verse 13. If it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged. So the king commanded it to be done. A decree was issued. So the Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 persons in Susa, but they didn't touch the plunder. Now so it's like, this went so well, give us one more crack at this. So the next day they killed 300 more in Susa, so now we're up to 810. Now the other Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and gained relief of their enemies, and they killed 75,000 of those who hated them. But they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested, and they made that a day of feasting and gladness. Basically, the rest of the book is, so that's why every year on the 13th and on the 14th day of Adar, we have a festival to celebrate our rescue and the slaughter of the Persians. We basically get the story summarized here. And then there's a short little chapter 10, which just makes mention of how great everything ended up and that all these things were written down and that Mordecai had high honor And last verse, for Mordecai the Jew was next in rank to the king Ahasuerus, and he was powerful among the Jews and popular with his many kindred, for he sought the good of his people and interceded for the welfare of his descendants. And that is the book of Esther. Now, for some of you, is this the first time you've gone through the actual book of Esther? Like, we know the Esther story in general, but have you looked at it closely and in all its weirdness and horror? So here's and when I mentioned at the beginning, let me just say this one thing, then I want us to discuss this book. So we see the plot line. We have Esther as a great trickster who finds wits to turn things on their head to bring salvation. We have the deliverance of the Jewish people, which is a common theme in many of the stories of Jewish deliverance. The part that's kind of interesting here, and my professor Alan Cooper used language in class once where he said, look, this is like Jewish fantasy literature. For people who are always under oppression, and always the scapegoat, and always the marginalized, and always the persecuted, and always the slaughtered. Here's the story where we turn the tables, we slaughter our enemy, and it goes so well, we're like, hey, give us another day of that. All right? But here's where it gets ugly. And I can't remember the exact date. I forgot to look it up. It was probably about 1994 on Purim, in the very conflict-filled city of Hebron, which is one of the Palestinian A areas. They have full control. You have the mosque built over the graves of the patriarchs and matriarchs, and you have a Jewish settlement that is in the heart of Hebron, which causes conflict. An armed man with a machine gun walks into the mosque during prayer and mows down a whole bunch of Muslims at prayer. And the rationale was, it's Purim. This is how, right? And people go, well, he's over the top. But it's like, this is what happened in the story. Except we go, hey, give us another day. We only killed 500 the first day. And my professor pressed us like, what do we do with this? Somebody took literally what, again, in his language, and this isn't, I haven't read people referring to Esther as fantasy literature, but I mean, that was his take on it, right? It was this like release valve literature that makes us kind of like smile and go, yeah, one day we'll get ours. But here you had a man who literally went in and slaughtered people in prayer. So, my final slide. I'm in the wrong one. My final slide. As we always like to ask the question, whoop, so what? It's a good story. Like you can't deny. This is a great story. It's probably one of those really nice pieces of actual, not, I shouldn't say actual, that sounds demeaning to the rest of them. But this is a more literary piece of scripture as far as like how we think of like a short story than maybe anything else. It's a great story. It's plot twists, irony, right? But it doesn't mention God. It seems in many ways what we would call like anti-pious, right? It doesn't seem like something you might off the top of your head call spiritually uplifting. So why is it in here? What are we to do with this? If all, right, everything is to be charisma, it's all to be the preached, what do we do with the story of Esther? And I was just thinking about this. Can anyone think of a time they heard the book of Esther preached on other than to take that one verse that says, maybe for such a time as this, right? We like that verse. If you took that, if that verse wasn't in the book of Esther, I don't know that it would ever get used in most Christian people's parlance, but we like that line. We don't necessarily like how we got to that line and what happens after that line, but that line, right, for such a time as this, what do you think? You are given the task of first week back to Trinity, preaching the sermon, and we say you have to use Esther. What are you going to say?
Is there precedent for the slaughter by the Jews of they were Arabs, in Joshua leading the people into the promised land?
Yes, you have in the conquest literature as we take our land, right?
Yep.
There's this common theme there that they were going to wipe out the people in the land. Yep. So what do you do? Holy war really isn't something we feel all that comfortable with nowadays.
But we do it.
Yeah, we just find other language for it.
Yeah.
What do you think? Or are we all now just disillusioned
No,
in Sunday
I would
school?
probably go completely off of it and talk about peaceful resolution and
Okay.
about how this isn't a good model. Kill, kill, kill.
So you'd use it as a counter story.
Yeah, or I would probably say, and now I'd like to introduce Dr. Dean Nicholas, who's going to be speaking today.
So when these kinds of passages come up in the lectionary, I always feel awkward sitting in church because I feel bad for the person preaching because they keep looking over at me like, what's he thinking? I hate that. It's just a guy sitting there. I'm thrilled with any of it. I just like when the Old Testament gets used.
Yeah. How did it get into the Bible to begin with? Do you know about the history of its inclusion?
It's a really late, because it's written really late. Off the top of my head, I think this is accurate. I'm going to follow up. I think it is the only book in the Hebrew Bible that is not found at Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't think there was a fragment of it, which means at that date wasn't widely used. Some have suggested, like as people began celebrating the holiday of Purim, like there's this question of like chicken or the egg to some degree, right? Like if you're doing the holiday, it would make sense that you would have the story. But it's one of those, I mean, that's why the holiday is so odd, right? Remember I told you the rabbi gets drunk as he's reading it, and people cross-dress and they use noisemakers and it's because it has that sense of carnival. Any other thoughts what you might do with it? Because I think there's one theme that you can tease out of it. I shouldn't say one. There's one that comes to mind, I think, by the plot.
I'm thinking, why are we holding the book of Esther to such a high standard? Because how many books in the Old Testament gave stories about how the Jews slaughtered 10,000 of these people and 10,000 of those people. In Esther, they only killed 500.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a
it's true.
minor sort of a book.
Right.
So let's not put ourselves in our Christian hat on. Let's put our Jewish hat on.
Yeah.
And we would say we were exiled to Babylon, and finally these people got their comeuppance.
Yeah.
God finally remembered who we were and sent people like Mordecai and Esther to get the job done and turned the tables on these people that should have been killed long before that. We only killed 500. And now we get to go back to Israel, to Judah, I guess.
Yeah.
So it just seems to me more of the same. It just took place in Persia, now Iran, rather than Israel or Judah. Now
Right.
Israel.
And the part that seems that the larger issue for some is that God is never mentioned in this story, right? There's no mention of God doing, God telling. They do pray and fast, but some have argued that if you look at the story as a whole, though, it's as if you see providence at work throughout, like the way things play out, the way things interact, the way storylines cross. They say, well, people have argued, you see the hand of God in it, even though we don't ever hear the name of God in it. I'll leave that to you to decide.
Well, there's still the faith of Mordecai. You know, he stood by his faith and somewhat kept a Jewish identity through all of that, of being in, he was in Babylon?
In Persia, in Susa,
In
yeah.
Persia, yeah. So it wasn't that he wasn't swayed by their religion or culture and that kind of thing, and kept to his Jewish way. So I think, and Esther too. She really. There's a lot of silver lining in it, in the fact that, you know, she was there. She was an orphan, and they didn't leave her die. She was a woman, and you know, she could have had if it wasn't for Mordecai doing the right thing, she could have had a very different outcome.
Yeah.
Is there evidence that she could have passed? Now, there's one verse in which Mordecai tells her, you've got to go speak because you too will get caught up in this. But I was wondering when I read that, if she never told and nobody knew, she would perhaps have had the option to go, oh, guess I'm out of this.
Yeah.
But she chose, and I think there's something heroic in that makes the book have
Right.
some merit, is that she chose to put herself in jeopardy along with the other Jews by declaring herself. So there's that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely this, and again, I would imagine reading this story, if you are a people that is an isolated minority in a place, the story reads differently than when you're not in that social location, right? So what's that like to be an underdog? And you use the language of being able to pass, right? I think of Greg Williams' Life on the Color Line, right? Where there's this interesting thing of when you identify, even if you don't have to. And in his story, there are these aspects where all of a sudden he's quote unquote outed and people realize who his relatives are, but that you get to points in life where you can move, you know, beyond that and you can create your own identity. How do you identify? To your comment about the faith of Mordecai, I love that line where he says, you know, I know God's going to deliver us, but maybe you're the fortunate one that gets to be the person he uses, right? It wasn't like, oh, it's all on you, Esther, because if you don't do it, we're not going to survive. He knew, as the people of God in the end would deliver them, but look at this, you just might be the lucky person who can be part of the story.
But then the other piece, like you said, as you go on, he also tells her, if you don't do this, you're going to be killed along with your family.
Right.
Isn't that what he said?
Yeah.
But how?
Maybe it was going to rat her out.
Yeah, I was going to say, how would that have come to be?
Yeah.
I didn't see any evidence that if she didn't tell,
No,
how would that have happened?
it's really interesting, though, because the question that's left to the reader, Mordecai seems to be a bigwig in the community. And everyone would know that this was like his adopted child. So you'd have to know that, you'd have to think that the Jews knew they had an insider that they just didn't talk about. And the fear would be when push comes to shove, somebody's like, how could you do this? Your own queen. And then it'd be that would be a different story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
does this sort of fit into the line of Maccabees and so on, in that it is, in Maccabees, you need to stand up for your faith, and there was eventually a rebellion.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, and it's interesting because the Maccabees, being in the Apocrypha, in the Greek version, in the Septuagint, in an Apocrypha, there's a much longer book of Esther. That story's fleshed
there
out.
is.
There's a few more speeches here and there.
Yes.
So if you look at the Greek version, the Septuagint version of the book of Esther is longer than the one in the Hebrew Bible. Yeah. So it is a story for people under oppression, trying to survive. So I know I just looked at, I'm sorry, we're past our time.
Okay.
You're
I have one question.
What's that?
Was this a Muslim nation?
No, it would have been a Zoroastrian nation.
Zoroastrian.
Yeah, these were Zoroastrians. We could do a
Okay.
field trip up to Chicago to see the Zoroastrian temple. So they had a belief in a dual universe with
Yes.
an all-powerful good God and an all-powerful bad God. And they had their minions. So yes, it was Zoroastrian. Ahura Mazda was the deity. So let me pray for us before we go. God, we thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for the book of Esther. We thank you for the puzzles and the questions it raises in our heads. Help us to see in it a picture of you at work in the world, even when we don't necessarily hear you named. Help us to see ourselves as a community of faith that you do work through. And God, help us to see that you are still and always will be the deliverer of your people. So God, let us be your salt and light in the world as we go out this week. I pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, folks, I'm going to be away on vacation the next couple Sundays, so I will touch base with Pastor Jody to see what the plan is. So I'll be gone for a couple weeks, but we'll see you folks.
Safe journey to you. Good. Thanks.
Are you
for-
going west or north?
I'm actually going east,
Oh,
going to Virginia, so see Julie's family.
Oh, yeah.
So,
good.
yeah,
Okay.
we'll see Monument
Good practice.
Avenue without the monuments.
Yeah.
We'll see you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. You bring
My
so much
pleasure.
light to my week.
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you. See you guys.
Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.